Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 132 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, we're going to raise the roof because we're going to talk about shoulder flexion. Yes, folks, that important movement for overhead pressing, getting things out of cupboards, giving really tall people high fives. That's the movement that we're going to troubleshoot through today. Because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from sports rehab expert. Ooh, nice seeing you there. Here's what they ask. Been reviewing your scapula debrief. I'll link it in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/shoulder-flexion. But I've been checking out your scapula debrief, and the motion's getting me a little hung up. I've always thought that shoulder flexion, upward rotation, external rotation, and posterior tilt were together. But you're saying that the scaps upwardly rotate, internally rotate, and anteriorly tilt. What's the reasoning behind this? Or is there something I'm missing in the research? People always drove into my brain upward rotation and posterior tilt help clear the space for shoulder flexion. Any relationships or misunderstanding there? I apologize if there was some confusion regarding this, but sports rehab expert, you're right. Upward rotation, external rotation, and posteriorly tilt are together as I go overhead. And the issue, though, is the plane that the scapula sits in changes as you complete full shoulder flexion. So let's unpack that. Let's go through the entire sequence of scapulohumeral rhythm. We're going to break this down into 3 different segments. 0 to 60, shoulder flexion, 60 to 120, 120 to 180-ish, depending on who you are. That's how shoulder flexion is broken down. It's generally, if you look at some of the research, especially I would check out the Ludwig article that I cite the snot out of, the motion of, I think it's like multiplanar humeral elevation. It'll be in the show notes, party people. But definitely check that out because that will give you an outline of what's going on with that. But 0 to 60, resting position of the scapula, at least according to this article, is about 41 degrees of internal rotation, meaning that the medial border is going to be a little bit off of the rib cage, about 5 degrees of upward rotation. I believe it's like 15 or 16 degrees of anterior tilt. That's the scapular position at rest. You chilling like you're Bob Dylan. Now, in the first 60 degrees of shoulder flexion, I get mostly humeral motion, and there's a slight external rotation bias about it. The scapula does not need to move much at all. So in that case, the scapula is internally rotated still. And that's magnified by the increase in external rotation at the humerus. Humeral external rotation means there's going to be scapular internal rotation. And the reason being is because if you look at the anatomy of the rotator cuff muscles, the external rotators predominantly, so let's say I contract those muscles and I keep the humerus fixed. Because they attach close to the medial border of the scapula, they're actually going to pull the scapula away from the medial border, aka internal rotation. I'll have a picture of the rotator cuff muscles in the show notes so you can kind of see that line of pull that I'm talking about and how internal rotation would be the action that's happening. When we go from 60 to 120, things get a little crazy. We start to get the scapula picking up the slack and clearing space like you've talked about. You sports rehab expert, you. So as you start to go into 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, the scapula is going to stay congruent up against the rib cage. So I increase or I reduce the space between the scapula and the thorax. In order for that to happen, the scapula has to externally rotate and upwardly rotate. This is going to lead to a relative internal rotation at the humerus for the same reasons that we talked about with the posterior cuff muscles. Subscapularis, which is the primary internal rotator locally at the humerus, also creates scapular external rotation because of the line of pull. If I fix the humerus and I contract the scap, boom, it's going to fall into external rotation. So you do get this combined external rotation and upward rotation. And that's from 60 to about 120 degrees of shoulder flexion. If we look at 120 and beyond, with that range of motion, the scapula is still upwardly rotating and externally rotating. That's still there. But here's what changes that allows you to get some posterior expansion, i.e., which I need some degree of internal rotation to make that happen. The scapula continues to upwardly rotate in ER, but the interesting thing is it realigns back into the scapular plane. The scapular plane is about 45 degrees forward from abduction, so it's kind of in the middle between pure sagittal flexion and pure abduction, somewhere in the middle there. So when it aligns in that plane, even though the scapula is externally rotating, from a positional standpoint, that is more of a position of internal rotation of the scapula. So there's going to be some opening of the posterior thorax in that regard. Couple that with the maximal increase in upward rotation, your downward rotators, namely in the posterior thorax, the rhomboids are going to be more eccentrically oriented, and that's going to allow for some degree of posterior expansion back there. Even though I'm still driving external rotation because of the location of the scapula, you still get some posterior expansion. So I don't want to have any confusion in that regard that there's internal rotation happening with upward rotation. Upward rotation and ER are combined. What changes, and that can influence where you're getting expansion in the thorax, is the location of the scapula. As you approach higher ranges of shoulder flexion, there's going to be more external rotation of the scapula, but I'm aligned in the scapular plane. That allows for some posterior expansion. The other thing to consider as well is when I go from 120 to 180, that's when the humerus begins to maximally externally rotate. You get roughly, depending on the person, about 60 degrees of external rotation there. If I'm externally rotating the humerus, that will drive relative internal rotation at the scapula. So the combination of those things in those upper ranges, scapula aligning in the scapular plane, increasing humeral ER, that will allow some degree of posterior expansion because there are some influences that are driving some semblance of internal rotation at the scapula. I want us to be careful because there is not this on-off switch between ER and IR. These are all relative motions that are happening, and you just have a few influences in the higher ranges of shoulder flexion that allow some degree of posterior expansion because scapular IR to some degree is needed in that regard. So I hope that answers your question, sports rehab expert. It's not as cut and dry as this on and off switch, but because of the scapular plane alignment and the humeral external rotation, even though ER of the scapula is still being driven, it does allow for some expansion posteriorly. It's all about location, location, location. Great question. The next question comes from Anonymous. I don't think it's the Anonymous that wreaks havoc on the internet, but it could be. I don't know. Here's what Anonymous asks. Could you explain what to do if someone overstretched the ligaments in their shoulder? Like after you do the shoulder flexion test and the humeral head pops into your thumb when it's in their armpit. What can I do to restore normal flexion, and can I continue to keep that person resilient? Good question. So I want to be clear. when you see something like this, so basically what happens in this case is if you're testing shoulder flexion, you put your thumb in the armpit. Sometimes in some people, you will feel the humerus migrate anteriorly, which obviously is undesirable because we shouldn't have that. What I think is going on is you're having that person fall into internal rotation at the humerus. So if I hit my end range of external rotation that's available, the way I can compensate and go overhead is by driving the elbow slightly out, and that's internal rotation. So if you watch me on the video, as I drive my elbow out, you'll see my hand goes closer to my head. That is internal rotation. Even though it looks like, well, you might think, well, Zach, I'm going out into abduction. Isn't that ER? No, it's not. Because internal rotation is what drives me out into that position. And you can see it if you watch on the video. If I go straight flexion and I don't deviate from that plane, especially based off of the Scapulohumeral rhythm article that I'll share with you, straight flexion biases external rotation at the humerus. So then we got to think about, well, what's going on that might be causing this anterior humeral glide? If I fall into ER, what may happen is because of the glides necessary to complete flexion with a little bit of internal rotation, that's going to drive the humerus inferiorly and slightly anteriorly. So you have some degree of it's almost like an anterior subluxation, but I question if that's what's really going on. Stay tuned why I say that. But you'll have a glide that's anterior and inferior at the humerus, and sometimes you can feel that if you put your finger in the person's armpit. So are we dealing with tissue laxity? I am uncertain. What I think it is there's some eccentric orientation of stuff in that area. The reason why I question if it's true laxity is because if we have legitimate tissue laxity, there's not a whole lot that we can do as clinicians to improve the properties of those tissues. One. Two, the other thing to consider is sometimes if you do interventions, you will see that change instantaneously. I've done activities where we've improved shoulder flexion in my supreme clientele, and we recheck and we see if they have that glide and it's no longer present. So in those few moments of time that I had a person doing an activity, did we really change the laxity of the tissues? I highly doubt it. Not that good by any means. So what's likely going on is you're changing the resting tension of the tissues, and that changes how the person's moving in a favorable way. If someone has legitimate laxity, there's not much we can do about that. That might be a surgical fix. The people who I'm thinking of are people who have recurrent dislocations who cannot get better by conservative measures. This, I don't think necessarily is what's going on in that regard. What we have to do is change the contractile bias of tissues in order to reduce that excessive gliding that we shouldn't see. And the way you do that is by improving your external rotation-based measures. The reason why that glide's happening is because I run out of ER, so I start to IR, and the humerus glides anteriorly to try to make that happen. And we don't want that to happen. So doing things to encourage expansion in the upper back can allow the scapula to continue to upwardly rotate, can restore humeral ER, and allow you to go overhead. Some of my favorite moves would be doing low reaches. I'll link one of my favorite activities to do that in the show notes. Starting with low reaches, working on single arm reaches is also a great way to do that. If I do a single arm reach, that's going to encourage rotation in the thorax, and that can allow for some posterior expansion on one side. So let's say my left shoulder is the one that has that inferior glide. If I want to improve external rotation on that side, I will actually reach with the contralateral arm. What that's going to do is it's going to move the spinous processes away or to the right in that case, which will allow for expansion posteriorly to happen. Once you have those things, then you can work on overhead activities along the same vein to encourage that last bit of upward rotation, making sure the elbow stays locked in. If you do those things, you won't be gliding, most likely, unless you have a tissue issue that needs addressed surgically. So get posterior expansion. If you have that anterior inferior glide, it's likely not a tissue laxity issue. It's likely eccentric orientation of anterior and inferior structures. So get some expansion posteriorly, flip-flop that relationship, and if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Great question, Anonymous. The next question comes from Corey. And here's what Corey asks. You and others have mentioned that when someone is compressed in the dorsal rostral thorax, dorsal rostral is the uppermost part of the posterior thorax. Usually it's like the first 6 ribs. And it's proven with your shoulder flexion assessment between the ranges of 60 to 120 degrees among other measures that you would intervene by reaching exercises below 60 degrees flexion in various positions depending on the ISA presentation. So if someone's limited in flexion, you'd go after lower posterior. We're with you so far. Is it possible that in this instance we could intervene with a position that includes reaching in the 60 to 120 degree range in the compressive ranges if we IR at the humerus? The question Corey's asking is, if you have someone who's limited in the 60 to 120 range, could you go after anterior expansion to help assist shoulder flexion? The short answer is yes. And this is where it gets kind of confusing because and even in that last part, I was talking, well, Zach, you need posterior expansion. Why in the hell are you now saying you could drive some anterior expansion? The answer has to do with the fact that we have to fill the rib cage up as a unit, really, to go overhead. So I want you to think of it as this wonderful, luscious Topo Chico bottle. When I fill the Topo Chico with that sweet, sweet nectar, that crispy goodness, it fills from the bottom up. I can't fill the bottom and then fill a little bit of the top and then have the space in the middle. So I have to have this bottom up fill in order for it to be filled with the luscious Topo Chico goodness. The same principle applies to the lungs when you're doing something like shoulder flexion. So in order for me to fill the bottom part of the lungs, I have to be able to get the stack first, and then I can choose activities that bias expansion in the lower part of the lungs, especially posteriorly. That's where doing your 0 to 60 reach is useful. How about this? In the 60 to 120 range, I may need to actually bias the anterior thorax in those same regions, and that's where reaching forward could go. And it's filling back side of the lower, front side of the lower, and then you would do the same with the uppers. So as you go up overhead, now I need to drive airflow into the uppermost segments of the thorax to get those to fill. And I really need that entire fill as I go through the arc of flexion. So in the lower ranges, if I can't acquire any external rotation at the humerus, I need to get posterior expansion. Now, if I can't get flexion in the mid-ranges and I start to drive into IR, well, I need to actually have some posterior compression in order to make that motion happen. So that's where you could totally justify driving humeral internal rotation or anterior expansion to happen. How would you know where to go? And that's really the crux of this. The way that I sequence this is, for me to know if I need the lower posterior expansion, that's the first part that you need to perform shoulder flexion, to T6, T8 expansion. I'm going to generally have a loss of external rotation at the humerus if I can't expand there. So if you have a loss of ER, you're going to do things to then drive posterior expansion at T6 to T8. That's where your lower reaches would come into play. Let's say I clear that. Let's say I have full external rotation, and I'm not doing like a compensatory issue either, where I have like 130. Because just because you have that doesn't mean that you got full posterior expansion there. A lot of times the excessive motions are because of a major shape change or tilting in the posterior thorax. Let's say you've cleared ER, and there's some improvements in shoulder flexion, but they're still limited. You may actually need to drive anterior expansion in that case, especially if they can't get to 120. How would you know? you'd have a loss of shoulder internal rotation. Shoulder internal rotation deficits would indicate you need expansion in the anterior thorax at the same level, T6 to T8. So for that, you might consider doing straight reaches, 90 degrees, something like that. If you clear IR, you may actually see some improvements in shoulder flexion. So what I've done, this is all assuming that you got the stack, of course, which I'll link in the show notes. If you don't have it, then you can talk to me. So I get the stack. I filled the lower segments of the lung, so I got posterior expansion, then I got anterior expansion at T6 to T8. Let's say you're still limited in shoulder flexion. You might have to move on up, like your favorite Jefferson's episode. So I move on up. I may need now upper posterior and anterior expansion of the thorax, and I would still attack it in that same order. How would you know if you need those segments? To determine if you need like T2 to T4 to expand, horizontal abduction posteriorly would be an indicator, and then anterior expansion would be horizontal adduction. Look at those. Things that I like to make that happen. You could drive like side-lying arm bars. I like those to get the anterior expansion, or posterior for that matter. Those seem to be very useful at making that happen. Also, driving trunk rotation is another great way to make the uppermost posterior, or the uppermost segments expand. Inversion activities can also assist with that, as well as progressing your overhead action without losing the stack position. All of those can improve the uppermost expansion that we need to drive shoulder flexion. So if you do those, and you can clear horizontal AB and AD, a lot of times you'll see some very nice changes in shoulder flexion. But let's say you're still limited. You've cleaned all that stuff up. You might have to move on to the next most upper segment, which would be looking at lower cervical rotation. For that, I will approximate C7 to T1 in theory, and I'll rotate the neck as a unit. Sometimes if people are limited there, you still may need to create expansion in the uppermost posterior segments to complete shoulder flexion. For that, that's where you could drive some of the moves you'll see me where I'm rotating my neck, like an arm bar or even a short lever side plank. All of those are effective at getting that last bit of shoulder flexion. If you've done that, a lot of times you will have full shoulder flexion. If there's still issues or you're having a hard time getting lower cervical rotation, then you might be looking at doing some interventions up at the neck and cranium and the jaw. That goes beyond the scope of this debrief. If you got some questions that you want to learn more about that, we'll just fire away and we can dive into that in a future debrief. But that would be the sequence at which you would drive expansion needed to complete shoulder flexion. To summarize this, because I know we went pretty in depth in this, get your stack first. You need to get lower posterior first and foremost to start the shoulder flexion cascade. If someone's got a loss of ER at the humerus, you'll need to get lower posterior expansion. Low reaches work great for that. If I have ER and I still have a loss of shoulder flexion, if you're losing internal rotation, because you need that in the mid-range of shoulder flexion, that 60 to 120 range, clear ER there. Forward reaches are great for that. If you've cleaned up IR and you're still at a loss of shoulder flexion, you'll need to then expand the uppermost segments of the posterior and anterior thorax. For the posterior thorax, I like side-lying arm bars, any type of trunk rotation. That works really good. Actually, and I should have mentioned this, but for the anterior manubrial expansion, driving humeral extension is very useful for getting the expansion in that area. If you do that, you got horizontal AB and adduction to improve. AB is for posterior expansion, AD is for anterior expansion in the upper segments, T2 to T4. You're still limited. You're then looking at lower cervical rotation. I'm filling this cup up from the bottom up. If you don't have lower cervical rotation, drive cervical rotation with trunk rotation. That works really well. If you still can't get improvements there, you're looking at a cervical cranial issue most likely. You may need to do things to address that. Stay tuned for a debrief in the future that will dive into that. Great question, Corey. There's something on IG that might be a follow-up. Z Doravie S. Umam. Hopefully I pronounced you right. Would reaching below 60 allow for the upper posterior thorax to expand as well? Seems that there's no concentric muscle activity in the top parts of the thorax when reaching low. Short answer is yes. 60 is not the magical number. It's just the range that you would go into. So anything 0 to 60 could theoretically drive posterior expansion. Really, if you think about it, anything that's going to drive the scaps into internal rotation is going to be effective at doing that. So awesome question, Z. The last question comes from Nick. Here's what Nick asks. How would you differentiate an overhead reaching exercise for the purpose of anterior rib cage expansion, manubrium, versus upper posterior rib cage expansion, T2 to T4? So I've actually been messing a lot with this because I've had some people where we could get manubrial expansion, aka humeral extension, improved by doing uppermost expansion as opposed to T4 to T2 T4. So the short answer is, in order for me to fully go overhead, I'm going to need expansion anteriorly and posteriorly. So you could get some anterior expansion in the manubrium by going overhead. How would you know? You'd get improvements in horizontal adduction. But let's just say, hypothetically, everything was clear except for horizontal adduction, your indicator that you don't have manubrial expansion. What would I drive to make that happen? What I've been using a lot more with pretty darn good success is driving humeral extension. And the reason why I think humeral extension works is because when I extend the humerus, that's going to drive some degree of downward rotation at the scapula and anterior tilt. Those motions ought to increase leverage for pec minor to have some concentric bias. Pec minor is going to pull the uppermost ribs 3 through 5 to allow for some expansion in that regard. So in theory, that should allow you to get some anterior expansion. So even though it's not like 2 and 1 involved, you can still probably get some expansion anteriorly. And I've seen horizontal adduction clear up quite a bit with those type of activities. Another thing to consider to get anterior expansion or manubrial expansion, because we're looking at T2 to T4 anteriorly, would be cervical rotation like we talked about before. But you have to look at where am I rotating to make that happen. So let's say I rotate my neck to the left. I'm going to get rotation, not just in the cervical spine, but in the thorax to about T4, T5. So if I rotate to the left, the spinous processes are going to move to the right. So in this instance, I'm going to get left posterior expansion and right anterior expansion. And because it's the uppermost segments, if you had, let's say, a loss of horizontal adduction on the right-hand side or humeral extension, you could, in theory, drive uppermost anterior expansion and improve those measures by driving cervical rotation. Arm bars work great in that regard. I've been really loving the arm bars with screwdrivers as well as the sideline arm bar to do things like that. And I'll do it on both sides just because most people need posterior and anterior expansion in that regard. So your targets are either doing overhead reaching to get the expansion, although it's a little bit more diffuse because you'll probably get A to P, assuming that you can keep a stack. That's option one. Option two, which I think is a little bit more localized to the anterior expansion in those upper segments, would be humeral extension. And then number three would be driving cervical rotation contralaterally. That should drive some anterior expansion in those segments. So it's not, the tough thing with this is it's not clear cut and dry in terms of like, okay, if this, then it's only going to expand here. It doesn't work that way. It's all going to be in gradient format, and there's a lot of other factors to consider, like gravity. For example, I had this great discussion with my boy Joe Cicinelli yesterday about the short lever side plank. And we were talking about, well, where in the hell does this thing drive expansion? So like when I do a side plank, You got to consider gravity is going to push the viscera downward. It's going to push airflow more into the downward segments. So that might get anterior expansion on the right if I was doing a right one. But then I'm driving rotation to the right, which is going to close off the right chest wall because I should get more posterior expansion. And then if I turn my head to the right, that's going to influence it that way. So, and the point being by using that is it's like, well, okay, where am I going to drive air? It's probably all of those areas, but you can bias things based on some of the information that I've just discussed in that regard. So can you improve uppermost expansion in the anterior thorax with an overhead action? Absolutely. You're still getting air there to go overhead. Can you improve it with humeral extension? Sure. Can you improve it just by stacking? Held to the yes. What I would say probably increases your probability the most, go overhead, drive humeral extension, drive rotation, and you should be in the anterior expansion nation. Great question. Oh, man, this is a good question. Sixu_24 on Instagram. What if my chest doesn't allow full horizontal adduction? Yeah, I'm running into this. Everybody's got big pecs except your boy Big Z. Well, you know what? It's funny. If you have a lot of muscle mass, that's going to bias you more towards concentric orientation in general because you just got more stuff there. Your body has to work a bit harder to maintain and preserve all that muscle mass. So, you know what? Maybe that's just going to be par for the course for the sake of the chest pump. And maybe you can do, you know, the alternating pec contraction thing. So, you know what? Maybe you got to lay off the gain trains a little bit if you want horizontal adduction, or just flaunt those pecs, baby. Flaunt those pecs. Awesome question. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. If you want to learn more, go to ZachCouples.com. Subscribe to my newsletter while you're there because you'll get access to a ton of good stuff. You'll get my free Common Compensations notebook or workbook that you can work through. You'll get access to my seminar, Human Matrix Foundations, which is the pre-course material to my seminar, which, folks, we got some this year if you want to check it out. I have one for 2020 if the COVID gods shine upon us. Charlotte, North Carolina, November 7th and 8th. Please check that out. And also, too, I have almost the full 2021 schedule. So if the world heals, we continue to do things with COVID, and by golly bows, depending on where we're at with that, I will do everything in my power to try to make it as safe as possible. Like your boy, he bought the gun. He bought the thermometer gun. I got masks. I got all types of stuff. So if we can make it happen, please go. But 2021, I got February 20th and 21st in Atlanta, Georgia. April 10th and 11th, Warren, Ohio. May 1st and 2nd is going to be Minneapolis, Minnesota. May 29th and 30th is Boston. August 14th, 15th, Ann Arbor, Michigan. September 25th and 26th is a new one, Wyckoff, New Jersey. It's outside of New York City. I'm still working on rescheduling Dickinson, which was in Pennsylvania, and Montreal, so please stay tuned. If you can come in November, man, I would love to see you there. Let's see if we can make this happen. So there's that. But go to my website, subscribe. You can also sign up for Human Matrix if you so desire. Would love to see you there. Other services that I offer on my page, movement consultations. If you toy, you're not moving as well as you'd like to, your shoulder flexion is whack, come do a movement consultation with Zach because I can help you problem solve through that. We'll run through a full body assessment. I'll give you some activities to see if we can improve your restrictions. And if I can't get changes, by golly bows, I won't charge you. So come check me out there. If you want to take that to the next level and improve your training and your fitness levels while respecting your movement goals, you can get on the wait list for online training. I'm currently not accepting new clients, but I do have some waitlisting available, so go ahead and check that out. If you want to learn how to improve shoulder flexion with your supreme clientele, sign up for my mentorship program. What that entails is Zoom calls where we troubleshoot through cases or some of the didactic stuff. I give you homework and I test and see how you're doing with your clients. So you'll send me videos of you coaching. I'll give you some critiques in that regard. Send me videos of explaining what's going on with these people. How's your education? Or if you're having some trouble from a business perspective, I can definitely help you with that. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com. Find me on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Search the Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There's 131 other debriefs out there, and not all of them had the brick wall, so maybe you just want to listen to your boy. Give that a shot. While you're there, leave a review so the fam can keep growing. I'm on the social medias, so find me there. Facebook and Twitter, the handle is Z Couples. The Instagram, baby, is Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And the last place I'm on is YouTube. Search Zach Couples. You'll find a gang of exercises that I use with my clients. Go ahead and give them a shot and see what you got. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I hope that you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.